Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. On today's show, we talk about how our individual experiences of the past influence how we act as adults in the future. In the first part of our show, we focus on memories. We all have our personal collection of events that we've stored. But how are some memories more powerful in influencing our conscious and subconscious mind than others? Joining us to explore this fascinating conversation today is Ms. Ghazala Hayat, who's a board-certified neurologist and teaching in the St. Louis University. She joins us from the US. Also joining us today is Suzanne, who's an occupational psychologist, joining us from the UK. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to this show. Ms. Hayat, let me begin with you. Now, of course, every process that we have in our body and mind has a function of sorts, and memories play a very powerful role in the human experience, recalling certain things, nostalgia, and trying to learn from your memories. What role do memories play for the conscious and subconscious mind?
First, thank you very much for inviting. If I would just say that memory is probably what we are. You know, if we did not have memories, we would not learn anything. We may not even know what name is. Everything we were born, and even babies, like infants at very young age, starts making memories. And memories are like, we can divide into a couple of things in the brain. It's the hippocampus is the main area where we have this stored. But we go through three processes: acquisition, and then we store, and then we recall. Recall is the most important thing. You know, patients, when later in the age, some of them, if they develop dementia, they may have difficulty with recall. They may have what we call immediate memory. They would see something and respond, but would not recall. And with age, we keep on. So we have two kinds of memories. One is what we call declarative type of, which is like when I ask you, what's the capital of France? And that's like, you will know, okay, Paris is the capital of France. Then we have like sometimes you're listening to music and it reminds you something associated with that. You will know about that too. And the third is like what we call procedural, you know, and that a lot of time we just don't even think about it. We learn it and keep on improving. For example, let's say how to fix the table, or how to connect your TV, everything. Every time you keep on doing it, you keep on improving it, and that will lead to our memories. And the more you do it, the more you learn about it, the depth of your acquisition and recall would be.
Right. Now, the question is, now she also mentioned procedural memory and how that helps with things, our mechanics, doing certain things. But when we talk about experiences and that sort of memory that is stored in your mind, why do certain things stick with us more than others?
How the connections are made, how the impact of that was, and then we have neural connection to retain it forever. And that's what will, and then what we also call is associated memories with that. So anything, and that in a negative way, post-traumatic stress disorder also is the same way, that when you're looking at it, something reminds you. Right. You know, it has nothing to do, and they will stick in that because we have developed a lot of connections related to that memory.
Right. Let's stay with me on that point. I want to jump to Ms. Suzanne and talk to her about that specifically, those negative memories, those associations you create, and how that memory is stored differently in the brain. Now, research suggests that memory that is associated to trauma, associated to extreme bad circumstances, is stored in a different part of the mind. How does a layman understand this?
Often the way we interpret trauma, we don't necessarily, what we believe is that we don't process it exactly the same as we would other types of memory. So with post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, people have nightmares, people have flashbacks. Now, we sometimes think of flashbacks as just being maybe watching the telly, but actually when somebody is experiencing a flashback, it's a full sensory experience. So that can be that people will taste the same sorts of tastes that were around, and they will smell the same sort of things. I often work with people who've been in car crashes, and they'll know really minor details like what was on the radio at the time, and that might trigger those bad memories to come back again. So while there's so much about the brain that we don't necessarily know how we store them, we know that we do store them differently.
Right. You're saying that of the mind, we don't know exactly how everything works, but you mentioned here the word triggering and how something might flood back. Does the human have a conscious will in repressing certain memories?
Obviously quite appealing if you're reliving a different situation all the time, or a difficult situation all the time. It's obviously appealing to try and block those things out. But unfortunately, what happens is that the more you try to block something out, often the more that it will reappear in other places. So it could be that you might just be doing something as a distraction and a particular song comes on the radio, or you smell a particular perfume, or you get a smell of petrol, for example, if you've been in a car crash, and those trigger those experiences again. So often the best way to kind of process them is to keep going over them rather than trying to block them out. So understandably, that is really appealing.
Right. Ms. Ghazala, when we talk about the power of the mind and how it influences the rest of the body, and we're linking this to memories that are very powerful, some that a person suppresses, does not want to confront, as much as that might be unhealthy for them. How does that physically impact their body?
So actually, yeah, that can very negatively, when we have these thought processes which are not positive or even anxiety provoking, and sometimes even when we are excited, even if like you have a very good experience in life, it produces a lot of neurochemical substances and which can affect, which is like in a negative way too. So we might be very uptight, might have more sleep, disturbances. We might not be able to eat, or those. So the memories could have very good effect and could also have very negative effects. So you have good memories, and so endorphins and all those things will have a better effect on your body. So that's why so always we say have good thoughts. I think it's not just a proverb; it is medically it's a very good practice too.
Right. Ms. Suzanne Guest, now when we talked about how memories are shaped within a person's mind, one thing that is often brought up, and especially when we're talking about trauma victims, is their ability to recall exact events or their inability to do so. How does trauma impact the reality? For instance, how the reality we store in our mind, can it be different than what actually happened?
There can be certain situations. So, for example, if you've been somebody who has driven their car every day and not really given it much thought, and then suddenly you're involved in quite a nasty crash, that can then make you what's called hypervigilant. So you're then overly aware of situations such as cars in side streets or cars driving a bit closer to you. You might think that cars are closer than they actually are. You might think that other drivers are quite unpredictable. And that's a direct result of being in a situation that has caused some trauma. And your perception of those new situations has now created a really anxiety-provoking situation for you the next time that you would get into a car.
Right. And how can a person deal with this? Now, let's move towards solutions. When bad thoughts come up in your mind, especially because of things that have been repressed, childhood memories, other associations you've made with them, how does a person carry forward? What should they do?
There's certain things that you can do. So one of the things is actually looking and trying to observe the situations that are going on now. So, for example, if you've had quite negative relationships as a child and maybe you was quite bullied, it could be that you look at situations and think, okay, did that person have bad intentions towards me, or was that person just a bit tired? There can be things like looking at how a situation, you've got freedoms as an adult. So as a child, understandably, you're quite restricted, but as an adult, you've got a lot more freedom, so you can get yourself out of situations. So looking at how you can extract yourself from a situation or extract yourself from the relationships that you're not tied to. If you're really struggling and you're looking that you've got clinical symptoms, then it would be appropriate to look at getting some type of therapy. If you've got PTSD symptoms, then there's it's a bit of a wacky type of treatment, but it is effective, called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprogramming. And what it does is it aims to replicate the REM sleep, which is where it's thought that we process our thoughts and our memories. And that maybe gets a little disrupted when we've had a trauma. So that's quite an effective therapy that will get away from those intrusive thoughts and the flashbacks.
Right. Ms. Ghazala Hayat, as we have mentioned throughout this segment, PTSD and negative experiences, for a person who is suffering from PTSD and might not exactly recognize that that's their state, what are some of the factors they should look out for, some of the red flags?
So the thing is this, that something with just like the sleep deprivation, as I said, they have difficulty, maintaining relationship. They become very sometimes aggressive, and they are usually, what we say, just snap. These are the things will tell you that they have this kind of PTSD disorder is probably happening. They will also have difficulty maintaining their sleep, and then also, may not be able to keep jobs. That's where we start what we call cognitive rehabilitation for these people. They have to talk to psychiatrists, psychologists, deal with their symptoms, and we give them positive, inputs and how they will do it. We have to stress about a good sleep hygiene, exercise, and also say psychotherapy for a long time.
Right. Ms. Suzanne, just a last question to you. Now, how do we make this conversation happen in a more productive manner in which people who do feel these symptoms, who do experience these things, feel like they can talk about it in an open and safe environment? What needs to be done by the community at large?
I think it's really important that people do understand that trauma isn't a choice. So people who experience these symptoms aren't doing that deliberately. They are attention-seeking. So there is potentially the chance of people talking with friends about how they're feeling. And then looking at, actually, there is no shame about going for therapy. There is no shame about having cognitive behavioural therapy or EMDR. And making that as safe a place to go as you would if you was having heart problems. There would be no shame in going to the doctor. So I think it's about being able to have open and honest conversations with people about mental health so that we can support this.
Right, and that's a very important point, something we're going to end this segment on. Thank you so much, Ms. Suzanne Guest, for joining us, and Ms. Ghazala Hayat for joining us. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we take a look at how our behavior is shaped by negative experiences and trauma. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Our social experiences play a defining role in how we act and react to people and to situations. Some of the most powerful experiences are, of course, the negative ones: abuse, accidents, struggle within the home and between parents. We all have these gray areas in our lives. On today's show, we try to understand how our experiences impact our behavior as adults today. We also discuss whether a person, despite their past, can take control of how they behave and bring changes in their behavior. Joining us for this conversation is Dani Bostick, who is an advocate of mental health and also a former mental health counselor. She joins us from Virginia. Thank you so much, Dani, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, what we're trying to get at today is how the experiences of the past shape our behavior today. And especially when we talk about childhood trauma, childhood abuse, it shapes the person we are as today. And now we know that you talk a lot about these topics. How do you think those things relate with each other, the person you are today and what happened in your childhood?
Yeah, especially when it comes to traumatic experiences, it's really hard just to I think, move on. People always talk about being strong, overcoming trauma. In some ways, it's something that people always carry with them and become so used to the way that it's affected them that they don't even realize the ways that it's affecting them. But when you're a child and you're experiencing trauma, especially extended trauma over a long period of time, it really informs almost everything about a person, from whom they can trust to how they behave in relationships to their sense of safety.
Right. And now as you're saying, it's rare for a person to be able to recognize their behavior and what happened because of how and what happened when they were children. But let's just dig a little deeper into that. How impactful are traumatic childhood events? And the sort that are especially related to abuse?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the trauma and it depends on the individual. Not everybody who experiences trauma is going to grow up and have post-traumatic stress disorder and experience a lot of distress, but some people do. So I think it's important to realize that everybody reacts to trauma in a different way. Some people can really just, move on, as people like to say, but for a lot of us, it's something that we carry with us into adulthood, and it's something that, although we try to normalize it, everybody wants to feel normal. It's really hard to think about how life would be without that kind of experience. And I think when trauma happens as a child, there really is no other way of living. Whereas when trauma happens as an adult, there's a clear before and after that often people can reflect on. There's before the trauma and after. But when it's especially something in the household that you've grown up normalizing, there really is no before. And I think that that's what makes the childhood trauma a little bit more difficult, because there's not a sense of normalcy that you can anchor yourself to when you're trying to address it and feel better.
Right. Ms. Bostick, now understand that you yourself have had an experience, quite a traumatic one. If you don't mind, we'd like to take that and discuss how that's impacted you personally as an adult today.
Sure, yeah. I realized in 2014 that I had been sexually abused as a child. And one of the oddest things was that I didn't remember it. But I had this overwhelming sense that something had happened to me. And I know for sure that it happened because when I reported my perpetrator to the police, that's how strong my sense was that something had happened. He confessed to what he had done on a recorded call. So it took me a long time to come to terms with my childhood abuse, to the extent that I actually had kept the secret from myself. And when I did face the trauma and really began to address it, it all sort of came crashing down on me. And I felt very alone and isolated and very defective, like I was the only person in the world who had experienced something like this. And I also realized that most of my adult life up to that point had been managing this sense of normalcy and wearing a mask to protect myself from my reality. So the way the trauma manifested in me was essentially, I was very shut down. I was very stoic. I did not have a full range of emotion. Anger was my main emotion. And I had to be busy all the time. I couldn't be still. After I addressed the trauma, I almost had the opposite range of experiences where I was extremely emotional. I had a lot of nightmares, probably more of the symptoms that you would stereotypically associate with PTSD.
Right. Now, as you unpack this for us, and of course, it must be difficult for you to recount it and talk about it, just trying to understand, when you say that you weren't able to remember the trauma or the traumatic incident that happened, how are you able to convince yourself that something had indeed happened, that you did have to take action and did have to dig deeper? Was it something in your own behavior or some triggers that you saw?
That's an interesting question. I think for me, I was in school for mental health counseling, and obviously to be an effective counselor, it's important to have addressed issues, in your own life, so that when you're dealing with clients, that your own baggage, so to speak, your own experiences do not get in the way. So the assignment that really helped me understand what had happened to me was that I had to write the story of my life. And at that time, I had some information about trauma. And when I wrote about my story, I realized I had a lot of gaps. And certain elements of my story, like my perpetrator moving into my home after my parents got divorced, became huge red flags. But I also had the sense in my body that something had happened. Parts of me remembered without having a linear narrative or a clear connected memory. And I've been surprised how many people have reached out to me with that same experience. And in fact, there's a book called The Body Keeps Score. So
Right.
I think people assume that trauma is about remembering and it's about our story. And I have a story, I just don't remember all of it even today. But the trauma can still, reside in you even without having clear memories of what happened. And then some people, of course, have almost like a photographic memory of their trauma where they can't not relive it and replay it in very vivid detail.
Right. Dani, stay with me. I also want to introduce Jody Todd Manley, who's a clinical doctor at Mount Hope Family Center, joining us from New York. Thank you so much, Ms. Manley, for joining us. Now, as you're hearing Dani talk about her own experience, and she mentions here specifically that in her memory, she wasn't able to recall exactly what happened, but her body was telling her something. How common is that, and how does that exactly work?
Well, she referenced the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Bessel van der Kolk is the author of that. And I think one of the things that happens when someone has a traumatic experience is that it's really difficult for your brain to process overwhelming stimuli that are coming in. And it's such an overwhelming thing, both physically, emotionally, psychologically, that it can be difficult to integrate all of the pieces of that. And so what people remember and how they make sense of their experiences can vary quite a bit depending on the person, the type of experience, et cetera.
Right. And using this experience again as a reference point, because I feel like it truly is powerful and it would resonate with many people who are listening and watching our show today. Ms. Manley, as she mentioned, when she addressed her trauma, her behavior changed almost completely. She was more emotional. The feelings that she was holding back, she felt them come flooding in. How normal is that as well? And is that what happens when you confront traumatic experiences, that your behavior does see tremendous changes?
I think there can be quite a bit of healing that happens even after trauma, particularly as she said she was working on those issues. She was trying to process those experiences. And I think that that healing process can involve kind of reworking a lot of what's happened in your body, what's happened in your mental state. And one of the things that trauma does is to disrupt that emotion regulation. So if somebody's worked so hard to keep those emotions suppressed for so long, then you have to kind of work through all of that and allow those emotions to come to the surface. And, there can be, whether someone's trying to do that and integrate their experiences, or that can be an effect of the trauma itself is getting flooded by emotions and having difficulty regulating those.
Right. Now, of course, as you heal, and this is a continuous process, it's not one thing that happens and then it ends the problems or the sufferings you felt. As you continue to heal, what works for you and what would you advocate for other people who have been in similar situations?
Yeah, and I think I like what you said about it. It's not a linear process, and a lot of people okay, I'm starting at point A and I'm going to end up at point B. It's definitely not a linear concrete process, and for everybody it's different. But I think the first step for me was facing what happened, and there was so much relief in understanding myself, even though it was painful. I recommend therapy. There are professionals who deal with this and understand how to help people. I found that the single most helpful thing for me, because I learned a lot of tools, not just concrete tools to manage behaviors and feelings, but I really learned how to accept myself. And, with Me Too, there's lots of pressure to share publicly. Nobody owns our stories, but I really did get a lot out of sharing with people. I share very publicly, but just people knowing that I'm a survivor of child abuse. So many people have reached out to me, and I found that sense of community is very reassuring, because I no longer feel like I'm isolated. I was able to just reintegrate my own experiences, but also feel less alienated from society. So in some, I would say, just facing it, getting help in some way, not feeling any shame about that, and then creating a sense of community where you can feel accepted and feel like a full member of society, knowing that you're not alone.
Right, and as you're saying that, it's very fortunate. I'm glad to hear your story there, where you're saying that you were able to reach out, and a sense of community, that's what you felt in this. But many people might not be able to get with that. Are there any resources you could refer them to, or you could point them towards when they aren't able to get support from their community around them?
I think reading books, reading other people's stories. Lots of people reach out to me who've read. I had an article in the Washington Post that I wrote in 2014. I would say 5 or 6 people a month, sometimes more, reach out and just say, I read that, and for the first time, I knew I wasn't alone. So I think if you can't establish a community, or you don't have people that you can disclose to in your community face to face, that there's ways of feeling that sense of belonging by reading other people's stories. The book I mentioned, The Body Keeps Score, that's very helpful. I think learning more about trauma. There's a book called The Evil Hours that's excellent. Just to kind of have more mastery and understanding and realize this is not a normal thing that happened to me, but my response, I'm doing the best I can with what I've been given.
Right. On that point, thank you much, Dani Bostick, for joining us from Virginia and sharing your story with us. Ms. Manley, going back to you and talking about abuse specifically and all forms of negative experiences which a person faces, specifically earlier in their lives during child development, how impactful is that when we compare it to negative experiences and traumas faced in adulthood?
I think that the early years of life can be very formative. And if you think about early childhood, particularly in the first 3 years of life, that's when a lot of the brain architecture is laid down. That's when a lot of your regulatory systems for stress hormones and things like that are formed. It's when you are forming relationships that become the basis for your understanding relationships later in life. So there's a lot that happens early in childhood that really impacts people lifelong. And so trauma that happens in childhood similarly can have lifelong impacts. And can really shape the way your body and your behavior and your emotions function because they happen during those formative years of life. I did want to add one thing to Dani's comments earlier about resources. In the United States, there's an organization called the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and there's a website that is the nctsn.org. And there are lots of resource materials and lots of information about a lot of different types of trauma and also different resources that can be helpful in healing.
Right. Thank you for sharing that link with us. I also, on that point, I'd like to introduce Saeeda Rubab, who's a psychological counselor and NLP practitioner joining us from Islamabad. Thank you so much, Ms. Rubab, for joining us. Now, as we are talking about experiences and those that shape our behavior, trying to understand a little more about this distinction between trauma and negative experiences. How do we differentiate between those both?
Actually, trauma is when child is experiencing overwhelming happening or distressful events which exceeds their ability to cope, when child is unable to take it. If something and emotionally, mentally, it's manageable for him.
Right.
Then it's a stressful or negative experience. But if somebody is unable to cope with it, then we will call it trauma. And there are different types of trauma, but relationship, they are neglected in their early childhood. That could be a smaller one type of trauma. We consider it smaller, but it's not. It's very distressful thing for them when they are unattended or in a situation where they don't know what to do about it. It
Right.
could be violence. It could media exposure as well, which is not appropriate for them in their age.
Right. Ms. Rubab, now, something I want to link to what our earlier guest, Dani Bostick, was talking about was the healing process. Ms. Manley also referred to this. Now, as you're mentioning, trauma can be different for different people. Is it worthwhile categorizing something, this is traumatic, this is not? Because it impacts people differently. And does that hinder the healing process, especially when you're trying to seek professional help?
For sure, every person has different experience or response and impact towards any happening. But we need to, for example, we can see nowadays, it's especially recommended that even cartoon channels or cartoons, this is under 3 or it's, more than for 6 years or something like that. We have to look into this thing that what age we are dealing with as a parent, as an adult, what we can let them see or experience. It's an adult responsibility. If being adult, we have already experienced it, then that is different if we are taking care of ourselves. If we are talking about child and adult taking care of it, so adult has to be careful about it.
Right. Ms. Manley, going back to you, no one chooses their negative experiences. No one chooses having traumatic experiences. In fact, that's the exact opposite of anything anyone would want. But it does shape us how we are today, how we talk to people, how we react in different situations. Is it inevitable that these experiences will change us in the future and will shape our behavior?
Well, I think no matter what people's experiences are, positive or negative, it has an impact on how we think of ourselves, how we interact with other people. I think that there's a whole range of different reactions to traumatic experiences, and some people can be very resilient even in the face of adversity. So having had a traumatic experience in no way dooms somebody to negative outcomes, but it certainly makes it a lot more difficult.
Right. And when you say it makes it a lot difficult, what do you mean by that exactly? How does a person's orientation change towards life, towards people?
Well, it depends on the person, and it depends, as Dani mentioned earlier, on that support network that people have around them. Even some negative experiences can promote growth. You can have positive stress, if you will, but sometimes that stress can become overwhelming and can lead to negative outcomes. It depends on the person, but certainly it can shake up your sense of security. It can shake up your belief in other people, your trust, as well as have an impact physiologically.
Right. Bob, as we're talking about this, trust came up, and that's something very interesting. Understanding the trust deficit that is created from these events and leads you into situations as an adult when you don't trust people enough. Can a person heal from these sorts of thoughts, heal from this pattern of thinking?
As an adult, they can take help from therapy. They can have support system. They can have psychoeducation about it, and there are a number of things they can do, work through it.
Right. Ms. Manley, how can a person recognize that they do have problematic behavior, and how do we really identify and define that? Now, we see certain people in society, and many of us faced this as well. We don't know how to react in certain situations, in certain relationships. How do we identify that our own behavior is problematic?
Would depend on how successful someone is in achieving their goals, interacting with other people, how they're feeling about themselves and their relationships, and could also be input that they're getting from other people. If they're hearing at work that they're not being successful in their job, they're hearing from their family members that their way of interacting is not useful, is not helpful. I think the cues from society, as well as those internal cues, as how they feel about themselves and about their life and their functioning.
Right. And when we're talking about this, seeing and taking in feedback, taking in the input, isn't it true that many people would be defensive to that? I'm trying to understand, how can we constructively engage with other people and how they see us, but also hold our own ground and evaluate for sure? Do we need external help for this? Do we need external reference points for this?
Sometimes I think those external reference points can help. And I think in terms of in society and as we're interacting with other people, one of the sort of slogans that the National Child Traumatic Stress Network uses is changing the conversation from what's wrong with this person to what's happened to this person, and really trying to understand that having difficult experiences, traumatic experiences, can make it more challenging for somebody to cope. So trying to look at how can we help each other cope, how can we support each other.
Right, and that's essential, the empathy that we are able to receive from the people around us, and that slogan that you read out, that what is wrong with this person, what actually happened to them. How do we get there? How do we have those conversations? Because it seems like they aren't mainstreamed enough.
Well, I think that's true. And I think that's why the research on trauma and the trauma treatments that are being developed in terms of therapeutic approaches need to get out more. And we're trying to spread that word and trying to inform more people about the impact of trauma and how some of the struggles that people are facing may have come from those traumatic experiences that they've had.
Right on that. Thank you so much, Jody, Todd, Manley, for joining us from New York, and Saeeda, Rubab, for joining us from Islamabad. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.